17-year-old female who has refused medical transportation to hospital by ambulance after a hypoglycemic episode that has resulted in her crashing her car into a parked vehicle. The paramedics on scene consider activating an emergency examination authority, questioning Odessa's mental health based on her decision to refuse transport. Initially, we must define what a mental illness is. As defined by the Mental Health Act, a mental illness is a condition characterized by clinically significant disturbance of thought, mood, perception, or memory. The Mental Health Act also outlines what a mental illness is not. Mental illness cannot merely be based on a person's religious, political, philosophical, or cultural viewpoint, or be part of a specific racial, social, or economic group, or based on their sexual preference, orientation, or promiscuity, and not be based on the taking of drugs or alcohol, or their intellectual disability, or how they conduct themselves, whether illegal, immoral, or in an antisocial way. Nor be based on family conflict, previous mental illness, treatment, or involuntary admission. Ultimately, mental illness cannot be judged on an unfair bias of a person's preference, beliefs, habits, condition, or disability. The Mental Health Act retrospectively outlines that having the aforementioned does not disclude a person from having a mental illness. An emergency examination authority, according to the Mental Health Act, Section 18, is a lawful authority given by medical practitioners to authorize assessment and treatment of an involuntary patient experiencing a current mental illness. The Act defines that for an authority to be activated, that a patient must show signs and symptoms that are consistent with a mental illness, fails to have capacity to consent, and the patient is the only person able to demonstrate consent, in accordance with Section 12. The use of these authorities subjects patients to becoming involuntarily assessed and treated without consenting, indicating a deprivation of liberties. These are justified due to the fact that a person suffering acute mental illness leading to major disturbance could potentially harm themselves or others without intent or conscious awareness, and therefore requires urgent treatment for the protection of themselves and society. In the case of Odessa, although she presents with no urgent harm to herself or others, she does present with potential harm to herself, indicating that although not requiring urgent treatment, paramedics could be liable to negligence if something adverse occurs, such as another hypoglycemic episode. This is likely the reasoning behind quick transport and the possible misuse of an EEA. In the case of Odessa, the paramedic is likely to have justified the EEA for Odessa on the basis of Odessa showing a disturbance of thought, specifically illogical thinking and a lack of insight, with marked errors in inferential logic. Her lack of inferential logic is evident through inability to understand that her diabetes is related to a blackout which has led to damages and the possibility of continued occurrence of harm if she fails to seek medical attention. Furthermore, it is likely that she lacks the insight to understand the severity of the condition and the effect is that it has on her health, and ultimately leading her to prioritizing errands above her health. Paramedic, although fails to acknowledge the other criteria required for an EEA. This is listed in Section 12 of the Mental Health Act. It identifies that a person must not have capacity to consent, which according to Section 14b involves being able to make a decision and communicating in some way. Odessa is able to state that she refuses treatment. It is therefore accurate to state that Odessa is able to communicate, and considering she is not agitated or aggressive and able to answer questions precisely, she is able to understand, therefore she has capacity. It is important to acknowledge that the capacity to make decisions, understand treatment, and risk versus benefit can be affected and altered by mental illness. Specifically, a mental illness that can shift a person's perception, reaction, or understanding of an issue. In Odessa's case, it was not mental illness that has caused her to present, but rather her hypoglycemia, an organic medical condition, leading to the finding of a possible disturbance of thought when asked to seek further medical attention. Her mental disturbance therefore did not incapacitate her decision-making, but rather alludes to the fact that she may require extra education or assistance in rationalizing her priorities, supporting the fact that an EEA would not be appropriate. The two issues that arise from this context is that for a paramedic to validate a refusal of treatment, they must, according to the QAS CPG, assess VRCA. And part of this assessment includes informing the patient of their condition, the benefits, risks, and treatments, as well as ensure the patient's decision is relevant to the situation. The case notes made no mention of Odessa being informed, or that her decision to continue running errands was relevant to her health. Therefore, Odessa has given an invalid refusal. On top of this, the Mental Health Act, Section 13, acknowledges that if a less restrictive way of receiving treatment exists, it must be pursued above activation of an EEA, especially in a case where the patient refuses treatment. Considering Odessa's relatively new diagnosis, it is likely that she has not been properly educated about her condition. It is clear that the patient's lack of insight leading to possible lack of inferential logic, and consequentially her refusal of treatment, may be due to missing information about her diagnosis and the importance of her treatment regime. Therefore, her voluntary consent to go to hospital may be just to sit down and explain her diagnosis and why insulin and food are so important. As mentioned previously, the fact that a patient's capacity is able to change based on Odessa's mental status, whether informed and if the decision being made is relevant, this signifies that a person's capacity is in a transient state. For example, if after informing and communicating with the patient begins to become agitated or aggressive, this alludes to the fact that the patient may be losing capacity and understanding of the situation. Family Law Reform Section 17. Anyone under the age of 18 is considered a minor and therefore has no natural authority. So in Odessa's case, if her parents are contacted and consent to treatment and transport is given, then it is legally less restrictive way of transporting. Alternatively, a law reform adapted from the UK law identifies that some minors who are able to show understanding, intelligence and maturity to appreciate the nature of consequences and the risk of the proposed care are able to be their own authority. This is known as Gillick's competency, and further, here in Australia as Marion's case. Odessa is likely intelligent and is able to understand due to her reflection of conversation, an ability to gain a license, although it may not understand the consequences. The Mental Health Act, Section 14, subsection 3, allows for another person to be present to support understanding. In Odessa's case, a friend or family member. This option allows for a calm and less restrictive way of transport, which is both legally and ethically safe. Not only this, but in respecting Odessa's wishes, the paramedic can protect Odessa's rights and autonomy while providing beneficent and non-maleficent care that conforms to the bioethical principles. In conclusion, an EEA is an inappropriate first-line option for Odessa. Although she is presenting with a likely acute disturbance of thought, leading to illogical thinking, it is unlikely she is suffering from a mental illness, but rather that there are other reasons for her irrationality. This may be her lack of understanding or the need of a familiar person to accompany her understanding. Addressing these gaps may lead to a less restrictive way of transporting, protecting the patient's autonomy and liberties, as well as ensuring the paramedics are operating within the ethical and legal framework to provide safe practice.